Paquete following the number 7, Hiercino, wherever he goes. Rivellino, watch Pelé now. What a beautiful goal from Pelé. El Rey Pelé. 100 goals for Brazil. In World Cup competition,
Edson Arantes do Nascimento is one of the most famous individuals in the world, but he's not known for the name on his birth certificate. People from all corners of the earth, even if they don't follow football or know nothing about Brazil, they will instantly recognise the name Pelé. He's the greatest player in the history of football, and the 1970 World Cup in Mexico is seen as his finest hour, when he led Brazil to its third world title. However, what the tributes to the 1970 World Cup often overlook is the fact that just months before the tournament began, Brazilians were debating whether Pelé was even good enough to play for the national team. And Pelé himself had vowed never to play at another World Cup, believing that the tournament itself was cursed. In today's second part of a 3-part special explaining Brazil's series on the 1970 World Cup, we're going to look at just how the king of football got his crown, from early retirement to undisputed soccer legend. If you haven't heard part 1, skip back and listen to that first, as we'll be referencing some of the points discussed in the first episode. I'm Ewan Marshall, editor of the Brazilian Report, and this is how Brazil became the land of football.
90 milhões em ação, pra frente Brasil, do meu coração. Todos juntos vamos, pra frente Brasil, salve a seleção.
Outside of Brazil, we remember Pelé being at his best in the 1970 World Cup in Mexico. But this is largely due to television and the fact that European spectators would rarely see Brazil play more than once every 4 years, or basically whenever the World Cup came around. I spoke to Tim Vickery, South American football expert, and asked him exactly when Pelé was in his physical and technical prime.
He's at his best, 62, 63. I had the great privilege of going in depth with this with Toshdal a few years ago, and that was Toshdal's view. And I went and looked up the things on YouTube and so on. And he's in another. He's on another planet at that time. On the goal he scores against Mexico in Brazil's debut in '62, it's an unbelievable goal. And then later that year, he just runs riot against Benfica. Runs riot. You're watching someone who's like a different species.
Now, it's worth noting that Pelé only plays 2 matches at the 1962 World Cup, getting injured in the group stages and then seeing his teammates go on and win the trophy without him. In 1966, as we explained in episode 1, he hobbled off the field against Portugal as Brazil were knocked out in the first round. So, in that 4-year span where he was playing some of his best football, audiences outside of Brazil rarely had the chance to watch him. And that makes us wonder whether Pelé would have ever become so revered around the world if it weren't for the 1970 World Cup in Mexico. And in actual fact, for many years it seemed that he wouldn't be playing for Brazil in 1970, believing that the biggest tournament in the world of football was actually cursed. Andrew Downey, foreign correspondent and author of an oral history of the 1970 World Cup entitled The Greatest Show on Earth, available to pre-order now, he has the story.
Pelé, after 1966, he had this thing in his head where he kind of felt jinxed by the World Cup. Remember, he went to the first World Cup in '58 and he was only 17. He never played the first couple of games. So he came in and he did really, really well. He scored a lot of goals in the semi-final and the final. And then he came in 1962, and in the second game in 1962, he was injured. And he only played 1 and a bit games, so that put this thing in his head that the World Cup was bad luck for him. And in '66, that was kind of cemented. The World Cup was bad luck for him. He was jinxed. He didn't like it. And after 1966, Pelé took a step back from the Brazil setup. He never played for the Seleção for a couple of years. And he said for a long time during those 2 years, I'm not playing another World Cup. I don't want to go. I'm not interested. It's not for me. And it took a lot of persuasion for him to actually come round and for him to be persuaded to go to play in 1970.
In the lead up to 1970, with Pelé convinced to play for Brazil again, he's a different player. Slower, heavier, and a bit out of shape, he seems human again. For the first time in his career, Pelé has bad games, sometimes very bad games, and sometimes several in a row.
By 70, he's played a lot of games, and he's taken a buffeting, and he's bulked up. And this was one of the things that was seen as a problem going in. Has he put on too much weight? And what he isn't in to the same extent in 70 is that force of nature, able to charge forward with the ball. The way that the ball bounces around it's not like Maradona or Messi where the ball's tied to a left foot. I always see Pelé. The image in my mind of Pelé is the ball bouncing around his ankles like an obedient puppy. And those surges that he did around the 62, 63 mark, it's unbelievable. He'd lost some of that. You see one or two, but physically, he's a little bit on the downside.
In Brazil, the debate was over whether he should even play. Tostão and Gerson, on the other hand, were the big stars. Playing Pelé was seen as a luxury. Crucially, one of those who was in favour of dropping Pelé was former coach João Saldanha, whose brief yet important time in charge of the national team we covered in episode 1. In fact, after one disappointing exhibition match, Saldanha went as far as saying Pelé was losing his eyesight. Here's Andrew again.
Brazil had played a couple of games against Argentina, and Pelé had not been very good. Saldanha said he was going to leave him out the next game, and there was a big sort of kerfuffle, and people were asking why. And Saldanha alleged that Pelé was blind, or not blind, myopic is what he said. He had bad sight, and that was it was immediately after he did this that he was sacked. Now, depending on who you talk to, some people will say, listen, the dictators could not imagine a Brazil team without Pelé, and that was a factor, a big factor in sacking Saldanha. And it's also that some people say, listen, Saldanha knew that he was going to be fired, and he needed to try and create a scandal, or he wanted to get fired. That's what some people said. Saldanha wanted to get fired. He knew that things weren't going well. He knew that he was under pressure. He was uncomfortable in the role, or for whatever reason. A lot of people have this story, or have created this story that Saldanha was involved in some kind of self-sabotage, and that was part of the whole self-sabotage. But he even went further than saying that Pelé was blind. He said that Pelé had some life-threatening disease. That was what he said, and he never said what it was. But it really affected Pelé. Pelé was really worried about it because he didn't know what was going on. And Pelé went the next day. He went to the CPD and said, "Listen, what the hell are you talking about? I want to see all my medical reports." And they produced all the medical reports for him to prove that he was okay. But it was a big deal. And Pelé, was really worried about it, and it created this. Pelé never really forgave Saldanha for that, because the two of them had gotten on fine beforehand, but Pelé never really understood why Saldanha did this, and it was a real kind of, a personal thing for Pelé, and it created this big rift between them that never really healed.
While shrouded in hearsay, this story is crucial to Pelé's success in 1970. His teammates have always said that he rarely reacted to criticism or held grudges, but there was something about Saldanha's claims that left him raging and desperate to prove a point. And thanks to Brazil's rigorous physical preparation for the 1970 World Cup, Pelé arrived in Mexico as a man on a mission. He goes into the tournament a different player, slower and less mobile, but strong and with a spatial awareness that no one has ever seen.
It's Brazil's first time out in the 1970 series. They failed early in 1966 because Pelé failed. Now here he is again, 4 years later, 4 years older. Everyone waits to see whether the magic is still with him.
Now, in sport and other activities, I'm sure you've heard of the concept of the zone. Where everything just seems to fall into place naturally. Like a pool player who just knows the right angle he has to hit the ball to send it in the pocket. Or a basketball player who just makes every shot almost instinctively. Now that zone, that's Pelé in 1970. In all 6 matches on the way to the trophy, he never once leaves the zone. And in Brazil's opening match of the tournament, a 4-1 win over Czechoslovakia, Pelé eyes the chance to silence the critics once and for all.
A sobra é para Pelé, que resolve tentar enganar o goleiro. E quase que ele derruba esse estádio se ele faz o gol. Olha o aplauso, minha gente. Seria o gol maior da Copa.
From within Brazil's own half, over 50 metres from goal, he spots the opposing keeper off the line and he pings the ball an immense distance towards the net. The entire stadium thinks it's gone in, but it passes just wide of the mark. I like to think of this as his own personal revenge, showing João Saldanha and everyone back home that, his eyesight was just fine, thank you very much. Arguably, Pelé's most genius moment of the tournament came a few days later in a key game against England, creating what our guest Tim Vickery calls the goal that won Brazil the World Cup. That's after the break.
Hi, my name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. As you know, we are an independent news outlet that lives off subscriptions, so you can support our independence by choosing one of our plans for the best content about Brazil in English. If you're already subscribed, then you can also buy us a coffee with a small donation starting at $4 and going all the way up to whatever your budget and your heart allows. You can help us refill our coffee mugs to continue our 24/7 coverage of COVID-19 in Brazil. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report. buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report. Cheers.
Brazil versus England, the winners of the World Cup in 58 and 62 against the reigning champions. This was an epic match that may well go down as the most important game in World Cup history. Let's let Tim Vickery set the scene.
Well, it's a game that's absolutely crucial in two senses. One is in the sense of what happens in the tournament, because Brazil winning that game, Brazil stayed in Guadalajara and they played Peru and Uruguay and then the final. England, because they lost that game, had to travel, played the Germans, took the Germans into extra time. So they've tied out the Germans, and then the Germans play the Italians in the semi and take that to extra time and ties out the Italians. And it means the final is only a game for the first half. After half time, there's absolutely no doubt who's going to win. The first half is equal. I think Italy maybe have more shots than Brazil first half, but they're not going to last the 90. So it is a game with an absolutely crucial bearing on what happens in the World Cup. But beyond that, because both sides go into the England-Brazil match, because it's something that stands outside the context of the World Cup. Both sides go into that that match with something to prove, especially to each other. Brazil. Or was it just a one-off? Did they have just that one generation? That it was the same side that won in 58 and 62. Was that it? Are they still? Can they be that force again? We don't know. They weren't very good in 66, and some of those players, your Gersons and your Jairzinhos and your Tostãos and so on, some of them were around then. So are they up to it? Are they as good as the 58 generation? We don't know. We're going to find out. And from the England point of view, because of the way that World Cup was organised, and the organisation of that World Cup is the start of Havelange's campaign to unseat Europe in FIFA. Because the organisation of the 66 World Cup manages to alienate not only South America, but all of Asia and all of Africa as well. So, it's... one of the things that's worse about that World Cup is the refereeing. Almost all the referees are European. I think there's only one knockout game that's done by a non-European, and the referees are crap. And so that much disputed third goal from England in the final becomes a symbol of that World Cup, both the organisation and the incompetence of the referees. So the England side, they're under a cloud. You only won it because you were at home, and the whole thing was set up for you. So they have to prove to a Latin American audience that they're a team in their own right, a great team in their own right.
This is truly a historic game of football, with both sides at their best in a tight yet thrilling encounter. There are chances at either end, and the momentum is constantly pulsing from one side to the other. Every time you watch the game, it feels like the result is going to come up different. Now, the only goal of the game comes on the 59th minute, and for my money, it's the greatest goal Brazil has ever scored.
Brian Lamone. Tostão still on the ball. Paulo Cesar.
Tostão picks up the ball on the left side of the penalty area, jostling and juggling his way past three defenders.
Picking up the pace now, putting some pressure, real hard pressure. On the England defence, Tostão.
Putting the ball through Bobby Moore's legs in the process. And now far from goal, with his back turned to the penalty box, Tostão scoops out a sweeping cross that lands perfectly at the feet of Pelé in what is arguably the only 30 centimetres of space in a packed goal area. Pelé, in the zone, instinctively rolls the ball to the right without looking, directly into the path of the onrushing Jairzinho, who brings it forward and pumps the ball into the England net with a shot resembling a blast from a shotgun.
And here's Pelé! Jairzinho! There it is! Jairzinho gets it!
In his legendary book, Football in Sun and Shadow, Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano described the goal as England's steel citadel being melted by the hot breeze blowing from the south.
It's a magnificent game, and both sides come off the field having totally won the respect of the other, symbolised, of course, by those wonderful photos of the embrace between Bobby Moore and Pelé.
The embrace Tim references here was immortalised by the Daily Mirror's John Varley, who spotted the two great swapping shirts at the end of the match. It's the perfect finale for such a momentous match. It's respect, adoration, camaraderie, and most importantly, it's the passing of the baton. Brazil had beaten the world champions. Who could stop them now? This was a special edition of the Explaining Brazil podcast, the weekly show brought to you by the reporting staff of the Brazilian Report, the leading English language source of Brazilian news and analysis. If you like this podcast, please rate Explaining Brazil with 5 stars wherever you get your podcasts, or you can sign up to the Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind the show. We also offer a 7-day free trial, which gives you full access to the site for an entire week without the need to insert any credit card details whatsoever. I'm Ewan Marshall, and I'll see you back here later this week for the final instalment of this special 3-part series. Until next time.